Thanks very much for the invitation to speak on behalf of the Scottish Socialist Party. Our party, since we were formed in 1998, have consistently fought to defend the democratic right to self-determination for every nation, and in the case of Scotland, not only argued for independence, but for a unique and specific form of that, an independent socialist Scotland to wipe out poverty and inequality. Self-determination is a principle that we should defend as a democratic right consistently. And for that reason, as well as humanitarian reasons, we utterly oppose the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, the gangster capitalist regime of Vladimir Putin, call for the immediate withdrawal of their troops and for the right of the people of Ukraine to decide their own future. We also stand up for the right to self-determination, the right to democratic self-government, if they so wish, for the Russian minorities within Ukraine. It's a principle we need to provide and apply consistently. And I think in this country, one of the tasks is to put pressure on the governments and to demand that they offer the hands and arms of friendship and of refuge to those fleeing the persecution of the bloody war in Ukraine, to give them refuge in this country. But whilst doing that, we should have no time for the stinking hypocrisy of Boris Johnson, of the West, of NATO and others when they prattle on about defending democratic rights. Because NATO is not a peace-loving, peacekeeping alliance. NATO is a nuclear-led alliance of imperialism dominated by the United States. And NATO has marauded the globe, not just in Europe, not just the Middle East, but in the likes of Africa, toppling governments, assassinating popular leaders, expanding their influence across the globe so as to keep it under the influence and dominance of the profiteers and the warlords of the West. So let's not have any time for the hypocrites when they preach democracy. We are the people that consistently fight for the democratic rights of national minorities and nations, and not these hypocrites that try to use the current situation to appear good in public. And we stand on the side of the Ukrainian people. We stand on the side of the Russian oppositionists to the war at the present time. We stand in the interests of the working class of Ukraine, of Russia, and right throughout the world. And incidentally, that's one of the several reasons why the Scottish Socialist Party is utterly opposed to the idea of an independent Scotland being part of NATO. We have to break from that. And we want to escape NATO, to escape being entangled in wars, to escape being responsible for the continuation of Trident and the wastage, the squandering of £200 billion, which should instead be invested in health, in education, in a national care service worthy of the name, in schools and in free public transport, amongst many other things that would help to wipe out poverty and inequality. For the Scottish Socialist Party, independence is a right, but it's also not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's a means to eliminating poverty and inequality. We don't want an independent Scotland that just continues simply to bow down to the dictatorship of big business, the dictatorship of capital, and robs the rest of us for the profit of the few. We want a socialist Scotland that can use the wealth of this nation for the benefit of its people. We need measures right now to convince the working class majority of the virtues of independence. We need, for example, to tackle the crime of fuel poverty in this energy-rich nation by measures like the Scottish Government investing vast amounts in a retrofit of all the homes in Scotland, free of charge, free insulation, new boilers, draft proofing and so on, to cut down bills and cut down global warming in this corner of the planet. And we also need, instead of selling off the wind power of Scotland for a penny, we need to instead demand public ownership of all forms of energy, so as to cut out the profiteering, slash the bills and provide clean, green, affordable energy to every home in this country. And to convince people, we also need to demand things like a decent pay rise for every worker in Scotland in order to at least match inflation, which is rocketing, as we know. That applies to the likes of the council workers who've just been offered a derisory rise of 2%. It applies to the college lecturers. It applies to the women in Glasgow fighting for equal pay 52 years after the Equal Pay Act was passed in Parliament. And it should be underpinned by a minimum wage of at least £12 an hour for everybody at the age of 16 upwards. That's the kind of Scotland we need to tackle poverty and inequality. And we also need to bring in measures, in my view, to conclude, like free public transport to tackle poverty and pollution. Not parking charges when you go to work, like the government is threatening to introduce and local government is threatening to bring in. Not increased taxation on electricity bills and so on in a so-called green tax. We need free public transport to make it possible to wipe out pollution, poverty and social isolation. In conclusion, what we mean by all that is a socialist Green New Deal, the beginnings of what would be a socialist Scotland, independent of poverty, independent of inequality, independent of the rule of the Tories in Westminster. We need an independent socialist Scotland, because if we're going to make poverty history, we need to make the rotten, corrupt system of capitalism history. Fight on.